We had been dreaming about this vacation for months. Emma and I, along with our friends Kevin and Isabella, were finally heading to Santorini in Greece. The thought of crystal-clear waters, whitewashed buildings, and endless sunshine had kept us going through the grind of daily life. Emma, always the planner, had gone all out for this trip: new beach clothes, hats to match every swimsuit, and somehow we managed to stuff it all into our suitcases. The day of departure came, and Kevin and Isabella picked us up in a taxi, all of us buzzing with excitement. The flight was smooth, and stepping off the plane into the warm Mediterranean air felt like a dream. Santorini was everything we had imagined and more. Our villa was perched on a hillside with a view that took your breath away, endless blue stretching out from our small balconies, the sea meeting the sky at the horizon. Our rooms were side by side, just like the old college days when we'd shared everything, even walls. In the mornings, we'd all have breakfast together, a simple spread of fruit, yogurt, and strong Greek coffee. After that, we'd head down to the beach, soaking up the sun, chatting, and occasionally dipping into the cool, refreshing water. On our second day, we had a yacht trip planned. Emma and I had been looking forward to it, picturing ourselves sailing along the coast, the wind in our hair, and the sun warming our skin. But that morning, things took a turn. Emma wasn't feeling well, claiming she'd eaten something bad the night before. Kevin, too, had a last-minute work emergency, a report due because of some crash at his office. We considered canceling the yacht trip, but Emma and Kevin insisted we go without them. "Don't spoil your vacation," they said, so Isabella and I reluctantly agreed, deciding to make the best of the situation. We headed down to the pier, drank coffee at a small cafe, and even bumped into some fellow tourists we had met earlier. As we chatted and exchanged stories, a nagging feeling started to creep in. Leaving Emma and Kevin behind didn't sit well with me. Isabella must have felt it too, because just as we were about to board the yacht, she suggested we skip the trip. "It doesn't feel right without them," she said, and I agreed. We decided to return to the villa, but Isabella wanted to stop by a souvenir shop on the way back. I left her to her shopping and headed up to our room, moving quietly so as not to wake Emma if she was resting. As I opened the door, the sound hit me: a creaking bed and muffled groans. For a split second, I thought Emma must have been in more pain than I realized, maybe tossing and turning in her sleep. But as I stepped inside, the scene in front of me was something I never could have imagined. Emma and Kevin, both naked, tangled together on the bed, oblivious to everything but each other. Everything froze. My heart pounded and my mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, before I even knew what I was doing, I grabbed a vase from the nightstand in the hallway and hurled it at them. The vase shattered against Kevin's back, sending him and Emma scrambling. They were shouting, trying to explain, but their words were a blur. I didn't stick around to hear them. I turned and bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the villa. I didn't stop running until I was on the beach, far away from everything I had just witnessed. The rest of the day passed in a haze. They both tried calling me, but I ignored every single call. I couldn't go back to that room. That night I slept on the beach, the sound of the waves doing little to drown out the chaos in my mind. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone approaching. It was Isabella. She walked past me, unperturbed, as if she hadn't a care in the world. She took off her tunic, revealing a swimsuit underneath, and dove into the pool nearby. After a few laps, she climbed out, ordered us both a cocktail, and joined me on the sun lounger. That's when she told me she knew about Kevin's cheating. She just didn't know it was with Emma. And then she made a suggestion that caught me off guard. She proposed that we become a couple, at least for the rest of the vacation. I didn't know what to say at first. The thought disgusted me, but then again, why the hell not? Why should they ruin my vacation? We drank our cocktails, and before I knew it, I was agreeing. We went to the villa's administrator, asked to change rooms, and managed to move to the other side of the hotel. I didn't even see Emma when I went to pack my things. I just grabbed what I needed and left. Isabella and I spent the rest of the day by the pool, pretending everything was normal. But the thoughts kept swirling in my head. How long had this been going on? How could they betray me like this? And what the hell was I supposed to do now? Dinner that night was surreal. Isabella and I went to one of the local restaurants, a cozy spot with a view of the sunset over the caldera. She wore a dress with an open back, her hair cascading down her shoulders, and she looked stunning. We ordered seafood paired with a local white wine, trying to enjoy the evening as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. I kept glancing around, half expecting Emma and Kevin to show up, and sure enough, just as we were finishing our meal, I saw her. Emma was walking towards the restaurant alone, looking lost, When she saw us, she stopped, clearly unsure of what to do. But after a moment, she straightened up, put on a smile, and walked right over to our table. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. Emma acted as if nothing had happened, greeting us with that same fake smile I had seen so many times before. Isabella, to my surprise, didn't miss a beat. She smiled back at Emma, even inviting her to sit with us. I could barely believe what I was hearing, but before I could object, Kevin appeared. He strolled up casually, placing his arm around Emma's waist like nothing was wrong. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, his expression smug. It was as if he was daring me to react, to make a scene. Emma broke the silence, launching into a casual conversation about the island, the weather, anything to avoid the elephant in the room. She was talking nonsense, something about how we were all adults and how there was no need to make a big deal out of anything. It was just sex, she said. We should enjoy life. I didn't respond, just stared at her, gripping my glass of wine so tightly I thought it might shatter. Isabella, on the other hand, was all smiles, as if this was the most normal conversation in the world. Then, without warning, she leaned over and kissed me, right on the lips, with a passion that caught me completely off guard. I could feel Kevin's eyes burning into me, but I didn't care. I kissed her back, just as intensely. Isabella pulled away, grinned, and grabbed my hand. "Then let's not waste a minute," she said, pulling me up from the table. We left without looking back, practically running out of the restaurant. Once we were out of sight, Isabella stopped and burst into laughter. "Well, how was that?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I couldn't help but laugh too, though it was more out of disbelief than anything else. She peeked back around the corner, and then turned to me, clearly pleased with herself. "They're arguing," she said. "Looks like we hit a nerve." I suggested we go for a walk along the shore, and she agreed. We wandered along the beach, the moonlight reflecting off the water, casting a soft glow over everything. For a while we just walked in silence, the sound of the waves filling the gaps where words might have been. By the time we got back to the hotel, it was late. We both needed some rest, so we headed up to the room. Isabella offered me the bed, but I insisted she take it. I made myself a makeshift bed on the floor, and we both fell asleep, the events of the day finally catching up to us. The next day we continued our act. At breakfast I noticed the atmosphere in the hotel was different. There was some kind of fuss among the staff, a tension that hadn't been there before. I soon found out why Emma had gotten drunk the night before, and in her drunken state had tried to swim in the pool fully clothed. She had nearly drowned before someone noticed and pulled her out. They managed to resuscitate her, but she had been in rough shape. When they asked me to look after her, I felt a pang of something, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the remnants of the concern I used to feel for her. But I brushed it off. I wasn't her husband anymore, not really. We were still stuck there for 4 more days, and I knew those days were going to be hell. But at that moment, all I could think about was how to get through them without losing my mind. The next morning I woke up early, the hard floor reminding me that this was no dream. I could hear the distant sound of the ocean through the open window and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Isabella was still asleep on the bed, her breathing steady. I quietly got up, grabbed my things, and slipped out of the room. I needed some air, some time to clear my head. I found myself walking down to the pool area, where I saw a few early risers lounging around, their conversations blending with the background hum of the waves. As I approached the pool, I couldn't help but remember what had happened the night before, Emma's drunken stunt, nearly drowning herself. I didn't know if it was a cry for attention or just stupidity, but either way, it only served to complicate things further. I ordered a coffee and sat by the pool, trying to piece together what my next move should be. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in, and with every passing hour, the weight of what I had witnessed became heavier. My wife, my friend, the betrayal, it all felt surreal, like a bad movie I couldn't escape from. My phone buzzed on the table, dragging me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Kevin. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, the anger rising in my chest again. The audacity of him to send me that, as if we could just have a chat and smooth things over. I deleted the message without replying. I spent most of the morning wandering the grounds of the hotel, avoiding everyone. It wasn't until I returned to the room around lunchtime that I found Isabella sitting on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand. She was staring out at the sea, her face expressionless. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, not turning around. "Not really," I admitted, taking a seat next to her. The view was beautiful, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. "I heard about Emma," she said, still looking out at the water. "What a mess." Yeah, a real mess, I replied, not sure what else to say. Isabella took a sip of her wine and finally looked at me. What's your plan then? You can't avoid them forever. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm just trying to get through the next few days without losing it. She nodded, as if she understood exactly how I felt. We could leave, she suggested. Find another hotel, or even another island. We don't have to stay here. The idea was tempting, but I knew it wasn't practical. We were in the middle of nowhere, on a small island with limited options. Besides, running away wouldn't change what had happened. Let's just see how today goes, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. If it gets too bad, maybe we'll think about leaving. Isabella didn't push the matter. Instead, she stood up and stretched, the sunlight catching her hair and making it glow. I'm going to swim, she said. Care to join me? I shook my head. Maybe later. She smiled and headed down to the pool, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. That afternoon, I forced myself to do something normal, something that didn't involve brooding over the situation. I grabbed a towel and went down to the beach, hoping that the warm sand and cool water would clear my head. But even as I swam out into the sea, the weight of everything followed me. When I returned to the villa, I saw Isabella lounging by the pool, flipping through a magazine. She looked up as I approached, raising an eyebrow, feeling better. Not really, I admitted, dropping onto the sun lounger next to her. Kevin's been looking for you, she said casually, not taking her eyes off the magazine. I know, I replied, my voice flat. I'm not ready to talk to him. Fair enough, she said, but you're going to have to face him at some point. Otherwise, this is just going to keep eating at you. I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting Kevin made my stomach turn. What could I possibly say? What could he say that would make any of this better? But as the day wore on, I realized that avoiding him wasn't going to solve anything. Later that evening, I found myself wandering down the narrow streets of the village, the setting sun casting long shadows over the whitewashed buildings. I needed to clear my head to figure out what I was going to do. The small shops and cafes were starting to close up for the night, and the streets were nearly empty. I found a quiet spot overlooking the sea and sat down, trying to process everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, I knew that I couldn't keep running. I had to confront Kevin, to face what had happened. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way I could start to move on from this. With a heavy heart, I got up and headed back to the villa, knowing that tomorrow would be the day I finally confronted the man who had once been my closest friend. That night, I barely slept, the anticipation of what was to come gnawing at me. I kept replaying different scenarios in my head, trying to figure out what I would say to Kevin, but nothing felt right. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Emma and Kevin together, their betrayal playing on a loop in my mind. When morning finally came, I dragged myself out of bed and went through the motions of getting ready. Isabella was already up, sitting on the balcony with her usual glass of morning wine, staring out at the horizon. She didn't say anything as I stepped out to join her, just offered me a glass. I took it, even though wine was the last thing I wanted. You look like hell, she said after a moment, her tone almost playful. Feel like it too, I replied, forcing a weak smile. Today's the day, huh, she asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. She knew what I had to do. Yeah, I said, staring down into my glass. I can't keep putting it off. Good, she said, nodding in approval. Get it over with. The sooner you confront him, the sooner you can start to move on. Isabella was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. I finished my wine, set the glass down, and stood up. Wish me luck. Break a leg, she said with a smirk, raising her glass in a mock toast. I left the villa and made my way to Kevin's room. The walk felt longer than usual, each step heavier than the last. When I reached his door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around to walk away and never have this conversation. But I couldn't. I had to know how long this had been going on, and why. I knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, Kevin opened it. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept much either. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in silence. Can we talk? I finally asked, my voice low. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The room was neat, almost too neat, as if he had spent the morning tidying up to keep himself busy. We sat down on opposite sides of the small table by the window, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Kevin was the first to speak. I'm sorry, man, he said, his voice strained. I don't know what else to say. Sorry, I repeated, my voice laced with anger. Sorry doesn't cut it, Kevin. Not after what you did. He looked down at his hands, clearly struggling with what to say next. It wasn't supposed to happen, he finally said. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I shot back. You hurt me, and you betrayed our friendship. How long has this been going on? Kevin hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might lie to me. But then he sighed and looked me in the eye. About 6 months, he admitted. It started out as just a stupid fling, but it got out of control. 6 months, I echoed, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. How could you do this to me, to us? Kevin didn't have an answer. He just sat there looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. I don't know, man, I messed up, okay? I'm not proud of it. That's an understatement, I said, my anger rising again. Did you ever think about stopping? Did you ever think about what this would do to me? Of course I did, he snapped, suddenly defensive, every time I thought about it. But it wasn't that simple. She made me feel. He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. She made you feel what, Kevin? Better? More alive? Like you were getting something you weren't getting from Isabella. Kevin didn't respond, just stared at the floor, his guilt written all over his face. This is unbelievable, I said, pacing the room. You two were supposed to be my friends. We were all supposed to be friends, and you went behind my back like this. For 6 months. I know, Kevin said quietly, I know I screwed up. But you have to believe me, I never wanted it to go this far. Well, it did, I said, stopping in front of him. And now everything's ruined. My marriage, our friendship, everything. Kevin looked up at me, his eyes pleading. Is there any way we can get past this? I know I don't deserve it, but... I shook my head, cutting him off. I don't know, Kevin. Right now I don't see how. I don't see how I can ever trust you again, how I can ever look at you without thinking about what you did. He nodded, a look of defeat washing over him. I understand. I don't blame you. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, I turned to leave. I need some time, I said as I reached the door. I need to figure out what I'm going to do, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. Kevin didn't say anything as I walked out, closing the door behind me. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss. The man I had once considered my best friend was now someone I barely recognized. I headed back to the villa, feeling drained, like I had just run a marathon. Isabella was still on the balcony when I returned, but this time she was lying back on the lounger, sunglasses on, basking in the sun. How did it go? She asked, not bothering to sit up. About as well as you'd expect, I said, collapsing onto the other lounger. He admitted to everything. 6 months, Isabella. 6 fucking months. She took off her sunglasses and looked at me, her expression unreadable. So what now? I don't know, I said, closing my eyes and leaning back. I just don't know. We spent the rest of the day in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. We were still stuck on this island, with 2 more days to go, and the thought of what I would do once we left, once we got back to reality, weighed heavily on my mind. The following day, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. I avoided the common areas of the villa as much as possible, not wanting to risk running into Emma or Kevin. Instead, I spent most of the morning walking along the beach, trying to clear my head. The sound of the waves and the salty breeze offered some comfort, but it wasn't enough to drown out the turmoil inside me. When I returned to the villa around noon, I found Isabella in the pool, lazily swimming laps. She looked up as I approached and gave me a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. How are you holding up? She asked as she swam to the edge. Not great, I admitted, sitting down on one of the loungers. I'm just trying to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do next. Isabella nodded, pulling herself out of the pool and grabbing a towel. It's not an easy situation, she said, wrapping the towel around herself, but at least you confronted him. That's something. Yeah, but it doesn't make it any easier, I said, running a hand through my hair. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get past this. Isabella sat down next to me, her expression thoughtful. Maybe you don't have to, she said. Maybe it's not about getting past it. Maybe it's about figuring out how to live with it and what you're going to do about it. I looked at her, surprised by her words. What do you mean? She shrugged. I mean, you don't have to forgive them if you don't want to. You don't have to pretend like everything's okay. But you do have to decide how you're going to move forward. Are you going to stay with Emma? Are you going to cut ties with Kevin? What do you want your life to look like after this? Her words hit me hard, and I realized she was right. I had been so focused on the betrayal, on the anger and the hurt, that I hadn't really thought about what I wanted to do next. Did I want to try to salvage my marriage? Could I even trust Emma again? And what about Kevin? Could I ever be friends with him again? Or was that chapter of my life over? I don't know, I said finally, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I just don't know. Isabella didn't push the matter further. Instead, she stood up and offered me her hand. Come on, she said with a small smile. Let's get out of here for a bit. There's a little cafe down the road that I saw yesterday. Let's go get some lunch and clear our heads. I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Yeah, okay, let's go. We walked down the road in silence, the sun beating down on us as we made our way to the cafe. It was a small, charming place with a few tables set up outside, shaded by a canopy of vines. The smell of freshly baked bread and grilled fish filled the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the simplicity of the moment. We ordered a light lunch, grilled octopus, fresh bread, and a couple of cold beers. As we ate, we talked about everything except the situation back at the villa. It was a welcome distraction, and for the first time in days, I felt a little more like myself. As we finished our meal, Isabella looked at me thoughtfully. You don't have to make any decisions right now, she said. You've got time. Take the next few days to think about what you really want. I guess you're right, I said, though the thought of spending more time in limbo wasn't particularly appealing. But she had a point. Rushing into a decision, whether it was staying with Emma or leaving her, wasn't going to help anything. We paid the bill and started walking back to the villa, the sun now lower in the sky. As we neared the villa, I noticed Emma sitting on the terrace, looking out at the sea. She hadn't seen us yet, and for a moment I considered turning around and avoiding her. But I knew that I couldn't keep running forever. I'll catch up with you later, I said to Isabella, who nodded and headed inside, leaving me to face Emma alone. I approached the terrace slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma turned as she heard me coming, and for a moment we just looked at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. She looked tired, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed, like she had been crying. Can we talk? She asked quietly, breaking the silence. I nodded and sat down next to her, keeping some distance between us. What do you want to say? I asked, my voice neutral. Emma hesitated, as if she was struggling to find the right words. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know that doesn't change anything, but I never wanted to hurt you. Then, why did you do it? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Why Kevin, of all people? She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. I don't know, she admitted. I felt like I was losing myself, like I wasn't the same person I used to be. Kevin was there, and he made me feel different. Different, how I pressed, needing to understand. Like I mattered, she said, her voice cracking. Like I was more than just your wife, more than just someone who did the laundry and cooked dinner. He made me feel wanted. I let out a bitter laugh. So what? I wasn't enough for you? Our marriage wasn't enough? No, it's not that, she said quickly, her eyes filling with tears. It was never about you, it was about me. I felt like I was losing myself, and I didn't know how to tell you that. I didn't know how to ask for help. I shook my head, the anger rising again. So instead of talking to me, you turned to him. Instead of working on our marriage, you threw it away for some cheap affair. Emma reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away, not ready for any kind of physical contact. I know I screwed up, she said, her voice trembling, and I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that we could somehow get past this and rebuild what we had. But another part of me, the part that had seen her with Kevin, wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice rough. I don't know if I even want to try. Emma's face crumpled, and she wiped at her eyes, trying to hold back the tears. I understand, she said softly, but please just give me a chance to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. I didn't say anything for a long time, just stared out at the sea, the waves crashing against the rocks below. I knew I needed time to think, to figure out what I wanted, but I also knew that time wasn't something we had in abundance. Finally, I stood up, the decision not yet fully formed in my mind. I need some space, I said, not looking at her. I need to figure out what I want, and I can't do that with you around. Emma nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll give you whatever space you need, she said, her voice barely audible. I walked away, not looking back, my mind spinning with all the possibilities of what the future might hold. And as I walked down the path leading away from the villa, I realized that whatever decision I made, nothing would ever be the same again. After walking away from Emma, I didn't return to the villa immediately. I couldn't. My mind was a tangled mess, and the walls of that place felt like they were closing in on me. Instead, I wandered down to the beach again, seeking some semblance of peace, though I knew I wouldn't find it there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. The beach was nearly empty, just a few tourists scattered here and there, their laughter and chatter a distant hum. I found a spot near the water and sat down, letting the cool waves lap at my feet. I replayed Emma's words in my head, trying to make sense of it all. She claimed she still loved me, that she never meant to hurt me, but those words rang hollow in the face of what she had done. 6 months of deceit, 6 months of her sneaking around with Kevin while I remained blissfully ignorant. How was I supposed to reconcile that with the woman I thought I knew? As the sky darkened, I thought about what Isabella had said earlier about figuring out how I wanted to move forward. It was sound advice, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't picture a future where everything was okay again. The trust between Emma and me had been shattered, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. The waves rolled in, their rhythmic crashing against the shore, the only constant in a world that felt like it was falling apart. I stayed there for what felt like hours, lost in thought, trying to sort through the chaos in my mind. Eventually, the beach grew colder, and the chill of the night air seeped into my bones, forcing me to get up and head back to the villa. When I returned, the villa was quiet, the lights dimmed. I avoided the main areas and went straight to the room I was sharing with Isabella. To my surprise, she was there, sitting on the bed with a book in her hands, though she didn't seem to be reading it. She looked up as I entered, her expression softening when she saw me. "Rough day?" she asked, setting the book aside. "You could say that," I replied, closing the door behind me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. Isabella moved closer, resting her hand on my shoulder. "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah," I said, my voice heavy. "She said all the right things, I guess. But I don't know if I can believe any of it. I don't know if I want to." Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," she said gently. "Give yourself some time." "I'm just so angry," I admitted, finally letting some of the frustration out. "I'm angry at her, at Kevin, at myself for not seeing it sooner. And I don't know what to do with all that anger." Isabella didn't say anything for a moment, just let me vent. Then she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay to be angry. You've been betrayed by the two people you trusted most. No one expects you to just move on from that overnight." "But what if I never move on?" I asked, the thought terrifying me. "What if I can't get past this?" She looked at me with those steady eyes of hers, and for a moment I found a small bit of solace in her presence. "You will," she said with conviction. "It might take time, and it might be the hardest thing you've ever done, but you'll get through it. You're stronger than you think." Her words offered a small comfort, but they didn't erase the turmoil inside me. Still, I was grateful for her support, for the way she seemed to understand without me having to explain everything. I leaned back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the day swirling around in my mind. Isabella shifted beside me, lying down as well, her presence a quiet reassurance. We didn't speak for a while, just lay there in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Eventually she turned to me, her voice soft. "Do you think you'll leave her?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to, but part of me still feels tied to her. 3 years of marriage. It's not easy to just walk away from that." She nodded, understanding the conflict. "It's not supposed to be easy," she said, "but you have to do what's right for you, not what you think you're supposed to do." I knew she was right, but the thought of ending my marriage felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. There was no going back once that decision was made, and the idea of starting over, of facing life without the person I had planned to spend it with, was daunting. We fell into a quiet conversation about nothing in particular, just small talk to fill the silence and distract from the weight of our realities. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day caught up with me, and my eyes grew heavy. I fell asleep next to Isabella, the turmoil in my mind fading into the background as sleep took over. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Isabella was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and even. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I got up and opened the door to find Kevin standing there looking worse than ever. His eyes were bloodshot and his hair was a mess, like he hadn't slept at all. For a moment I considered slamming the door in his face, but something in his expression stopped me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse. I sighed, stepping out into the hallway and closing the door behind me. "What is it, Kevin?" He looked down at the floor, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I booked a flight out this afternoon. I can't stay here anymore." I was surprised by his words, but at the same time I couldn't blame him. Staying in that villa with everything that had happened was like living in a pressure cooker, and it was clear that neither of us could handle it much longer. "Where are you going?" I asked, not sure why I cared. "Back home," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "What about Emma?" I asked after a moment. "Have you talked to her?" He shook his head. I can't face her. Not after everything. I know I've ruined things and there's no fixing it." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, and I could see the weight of his guilt bearing down on him. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered what he had done and the sympathy faded. "Maybe it's best if you leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's nothing left for you here." Kevin seemed to realize that because he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway alone with my thoughts. As I watched him go, I felt a strange sense of closure. Kevin was leaving, and soon this whole nightmare would be over. But the decisions I had to make about Emma, about my future, those were still hanging over me like a dark cloud. I went back into the room, closing the door quietly behind me. Isabella was awake now, sitting up in bed, her expression curious. "Who was that?" "Kevin," I said, sinking back down onto the bed. "He's leaving. He and Isabella are done." She looked surprised but didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sighed, shaking her head. "I can't say I'm shocked. This place is toxic now." "Yeah," I agreed, the exhaustion from the past few days settling over me like a heavy blanket. "I think I'm going to go for a walk. I need to clear my head." Isabella nodded, understanding. "Take your time," she said. "I'll be here if you need to talk." The final day on Santorini dawned, and the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days hung heavily in the air. I woke up early, the tension gnawing at me, and decided to take one last walk around the island before facing the reality of what I had to do. As I walked, the beauty of the island stood in stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. The whitewashed buildings gleamed in the morning sun, and the sea sparkled with an almost unnatural clarity. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, knowing that this place, which was supposed to be a paradise, had become the backdrop for one of the worst experiences of my life. When I returned to the villa, I found Isabella packing her things. She glanced up when I entered, offering me a small smile. "Ready to go home?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Yeah," I said, though the word felt heavy on my tongue. "I think it's time." We packed our bags in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Isabella had been a good companion through all of this, steady, supportive, but never pushing too hard. I was grateful for that, but I knew that once we left this place, our paths would likely diverge. As we finished packing, I couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. I knew I had to talk to Emma one last time before we left. There was no point in dragging things out any more than they already had been. "I'll be back in a bit," I said to Isabella. "I need to talk to her." Isabella nodded, understanding. "Take your time." I walked down the hall to the room Emma and I had originally shared. I hesitated outside the door, steeling myself for what I knew was going to be a difficult conversation. Finally, I knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet villa. Emma opened the door, looking tired and worn out. Her eyes were puffy from crying and her hair was a mess. She didn't say anything as she stepped aside to let me in. We stood there in the room, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I knew what I had to say, but finding the right words felt impossible. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice small, almost timid. "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "It's time to go home." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "What happens when we get back?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment I had been dreading. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I can't pretend like things can go back to the way they were. Too much has happened. Too much damage has been done." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't protest. She didn't beg or try to convince me otherwise. She just nodded, accepting what I was saying. I understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. I need space, I continued, my resolve firm. I need time to figure out what my life looks like without you in it, and I think you need the same. Emma wiped at her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I never wanted it to end like this, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are, I said quietly. But sorry isn't enough. Not this time. We stood there for a long moment, the reality of what was happening settling in around us. This was the end of our marriage, the end of everything we had built together over the past few years. It was hard to accept, but it was the truth, and there was no point in denying it any longer. I guess this is goodbye, Emma said finally, her voice trembling. Yeah, I said, feeling the finality of the word. I guess it is. I turned to leave, but just before I walked out the door, I paused and looked back at her. Take care of yourself, Emma, I said, my voice soft. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. You too, she whispered. And with that, I walked out of the room, out of the villa, and out of the life we had once shared. It was over. Back in the room I now shared with Isabella, I found her waiting for me, her suitcase by the door. Everything okay, she asked gently. Not really, I admitted, the weight of the conversation with Emma still heavy on my shoulders, but it's done. Isabella nodded, giving me a small, understanding smile. You did what you had to do. We left the villa together, catching a taxi to the airport. The ride was quiet, the tension of the past few days still hanging in the air. As we boarded the plane and took our seats, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. A relief that this nightmare was finally over, and sadness for everything I had lost. The flight back home felt longer than the journey to Santorini. Isabella and I didn't talk much, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we landed, we exchanged a few words, polite goodbyes, well wishes for the future, but we both knew that this was where our paths diverged. I watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. I could have pursued something more with her, but deep down I knew that wasn't what I needed right now. I needed time to heal, to rebuild my life on my own terms. When I finally arrived home, the house felt empty, hollow. I set my suitcase down and looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings that now felt foreign. The quiet was overwhelming, and for the first time the full weight of what had happened hit me. My marriage was over, my best friend was gone, my life, as I knew it, had been turned upside down. But as I stood there in the silence, I realized that this was also a new beginning.